Welcome to a webinar on value-based payment for primary care and behavioral health practices. This is the third webinar in a series brought to you by Millennium Collaborative Care and community partners of Western New York. We are thrilled to be able to offer a candid and insightful interview with Randi Kohn, Assistant Vice President, Regulatory Planning at the Montefiore Health System.
Randi Kohn, the Assistant Vice President, Regulatory Planning at Montefiore Health System. I've been at Montefiore for almost 27 years now, so I've seen a lot of interesting transitions in healthcare and other things where we've, feel like we haven't moved very far, as not just as Montefiore Healthcare System, but as a healthcare system in this country in general. But then there's a lot of exciting opportunities that have happened that, we hope to be proactive in planning for. Other times we end up being reactive. My role at Montefiore has increased. When I started at Montefiore, we were 2 hospitals and it was just Montefiore Medical Center. We're now a health system with 10 hospitals and over 200 ambulatory sites in the Bronx and the Hudson Valley. And I spend a good part of my time both trying to help interpret regulations, but then also in implementing programs, projects, etc., that address those regulations and making sure that we also are compliant in those regulations with the New York State Department of Health, the New York State Office of Mental Health, the New York State Office of Alcoholism and Substance Abuse, the Office of People with Developmental Disabilities, because in the world of Montefiore, we actually have services that cover that entire spectrum. And Montefiore also has a significant care management arm, and we've been doing that for many, many years. So, the big challenge in my job is trying to stay up on all of this and making sure that we are presenting programs and projects in a way that are, moving our agenda and our strategy forward, but also in our partnerships with others around the state and our partnerships with the state that we are moving things forward in the right way.
I then asked Randi to talk to us about the recent updates from the Department of Health around the expansion of telehealth. We also talked about the expansion of what Randi will call telemental or telemental health, which is a variety of mental health and behavioral health services that could be provided by a range of practitioners. Let's listen in to see what Randi says about telehealth.
Guidance and regulation that they're asking us to abide by is important because I know, and I'm sure others have seen in their own worlds, the movement of telehealth and folks trying to do some things and doing some things sort of in the absence of these regulations. And so understanding what can and can't be done, and obviously for most of us that have to worry about the bottom line, being able to do things that you can actually get reimbursement for. And in our, in the Montefiore world, as I'm sure in others, we have a significant Medicaid population. And so it was really important to understand the parameters here and understanding, the ability to be able to, get reimbursement for the services provided in using the telehealth methodology. It's interesting, and I guess, the frustrating thing for me now that I've seen these two, the Medicaid update from DOH and the OMH regulations proposed, is that there's a lot of alignment, which is good, but there are some things that are very different, and also some things that are missing in terms of really being able to understand what they're talking about. So sort of the first and foremost, I think where the state has disappointed me for sure, and I'm sure others, is that it would be helpful if there was, a set of guidance that no matter which agency you're licensed for, you follow that guidance. And there may be some nuances, certainly with telemental services and the OASIS regs, when and if they come out. There's a sensitivity, there's a higher degree of confidentiality and security that's necessary with that type, the type of services that they're providing. And but they could have, I still think that they could have found a way to address those things, but have one thing that's in front of people. So that's sort of my disappointment in this right now. I mean, I think the alignment has been in terms of defining. They use funny terminology, but the originating site and the distant site. The originating site being where the patient is, and the distant site being where the provider is. And they both have addressed something that I think was missing before, which was that a patient's home is considered a valid originating site. So a patient can receive telehealth services while they're in their home by a provider that is, and potentially a provider that's in a private office or even in their home, although the details are unclear there. So, I think that there's a lot of positive here in terms of really laying out who the providers can be, how, and certainly in the telemental regs, they were very specific about which types of providers are allowed to be telemental providers, excuse me, what kind of licensure or what kind of certification or whatever is applicable. And then in the telemental regs, it's very clear. They actually very much lay out, you have to apply to get approval for providing telehealth, although there's some language in there that's also very confusing about is it a blanket application, or is it, and what is that form in terms of anything that you have to do to reach out to the field office of the Office of Mental Health. So, I have a note here that just says the devil's in the details, because as always, it's, how these regulations get interpreted and implemented by the Office of Mental Health is, that remains to be seen. And the Medicaid update, which is for the Article 28, there's nothing in there that tells me you have to let them know, that you have to let the state know that you're providing this service. There's just, they actually provide billing codes and modifiers for billing codes in terms of where this particular bill and what the service is that is being billed. So there's some good details in the Medicaid update for DOH in terms of getting into the brass tacks of how you actually bill for services, whereas in the telemental regs, there's some very general discussion about something to the effect of rates to be determined or something, by the office. And so, it's a good start in my mind, but I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done to help the provider world understand and wade through, actually how they're going to do this, and that everybody's not off doing something and they're like, well, no, you couldn't do it that way, so now we're not going to pay you for it. And you've developed a budget based on a set of assumptions that don't necessarily come out from here.
Randi, let me jump in and ask you a question, because I just as you were saying that, it was sounding like a familiar challenge that I think many of us have seen for a period of time. And I think that the change here in originating site is fabulous, because it was pretty limited before. So that right. Is one of the things we would celebrate. But I do think it's interesting, sort of the difference where if you are an Article 28 provider, as you said, you have much more free reign in terms of looking at this originating site list, potentially providing an array of services. And if you're if you're coming from one of the Office of Mental Health, OASIS, OPWDD agencies, your process is going to probably be much more regulated, right? Because and I just want to be sort of overt in that, and what you're saying, that
that difference, which I think we've been feeling on a variety of things, seems to be continuing as we start to think about telehealth. I just want to make sure I'm right on that. If I'm wrong,
correct. Yeah, and I'm glad you, because that was another aspect of this, and I think it's dependent on the type of provider, but I can just give you an example. In the Montefiore world, we have multiple sites in the system that have more than one license. So we have sites that have Article 28 and Article 31 licenses. We have sites that have Article 28 and Article 32 licenses, and we have sites that have all three of those. And so it really becomes, and it's very unclear in any of this, so which is going to end up, trumping the other, and which set of rules are we supposed to follow? And maybe it depends on the type of service. It's very unclear, though.
Yep.
The other thing to add on top of that is, and I know that there's some further discussion on the integrated services piece, but we have in Montefiore a variety of versions, I would say, of integrated outpatient services from sites that we've had in operation for 20, 30 years that are providing multiple services, and in those cases we have the dual licensure, or even the triple licensure. But we have other sites. We have a site that was, when they were doing the pilot project, that we have an integrated services approval under that pilot, and then sort of fast forward again, and you have there's the district project process for integrated services approval. There's the separate from district process of integrated services approval that happens just in the normal filing of whether it's a CON or an application to OMH or OASIS. And so all of those things, and I think the integrated services piece is actually the most interesting question here about which do you follow. So for example, if you're an Article 28 site, you have approval as an integrated services provider, so you can provide mental health services. Are you following the Article 28 rules and regulations for telehealth because you're in Article 28, or are you following the Article 31 regulations even though you're not an Article 31, you have the integrated approval through your Article 28. So those are a lot of these, that's just an example of one, but a lot of these very confusing approaches that these regulations, or the proposed regulations, aren't. Montefiore is doing it.
Next, we moved on to talking about integrated care and regulation, and we close out by talking about some predictions from Randi.
Guidance was doing integrated care before it was fashionable, and we've seen an evolution. So like I said, we started with sites that have had multiple licenses, and then at some point, and time flies, so I'm trying to remember if it was maybe like 6 or 7 years ago, our primary care extension clinic sites wanted to be able to provide mental health services. They knew they weren't reaching the 30% threshold that existed, which would have required them to be in Article 31. So we went and filed CON applications to DOH to add, at the time, the operating certificate category was psychological, was the service to be listed on the operating certificate, which would allow us to provide mental health services. And there's a little disconnect, because it's not that a psychologist had to be the provider, but that's just how they listed the service. So we went through a process, submitted, I can't remember, 7 or 8 CON applications to add psychology to the operating certificates of these primary care extension clinics, which allowed them to provide this service and bill. And of course, at that point in time, we were still limited. A patient couldn't come on one day and get a primary care service and a behavioral health service, and we would be able to bill for both of those on that particular day. So, that goes back a few years. And then as the integrated services concept started to evolve at the state level, and they started with the pilot project that was led by the Office of Mental Health, which we participated in with one of our sites that was only in Article 31, and we were one of the pilot institutions that would enable us to provide primary care there and be able to bill and collect for 2 services on a given day. I will say during that pilot process, super frustrating. It was, I actually think we probably still haven't been paid for some of the primary care visits that were provided in that one, I think it was just 1 year's time was that pilot. And the other thing that we encountered at that time was difficulty with our Medicaid managed care companies. So Medicaid fee-for-service, everything was set up, everything was in line. The state had said, we will make sure that the Medicaid managed care plans, understand this and understand, how these visits would get billed. And that was also, a huge ladder that we had to climb then, and I think that we still are. And then since that pilot, the state, as I mentioned before, we have the just sort of straight integrated services regulations that came out, and there was a process depending on what license you held and what license you were looking for or what additional service you wanted to provide, in an application process through either DOH or OMH, OASIS. OMH and OASIS got together and they have their application process if you want to do integrated services. DOH has their own process. And that allows it sort of took that pilot to the next level and just codified the ability to do that. But then we also have in the world of DSRIP, and they have a different application process for integrated services. So, I think it's very positive that it has enhanced the ability to provide a spectrum of services to a population that is coming to see you for something, and you are able to provide them with, within the ability of the providers that you have and the scope of services you're providing, to really treat the whole patient as much as possible without them having to go somewhere else. So I think, any of these steps has been a real positive. And I think depending on the region where you are, I know we have patient populations that, if we can capture them in one place and provide as much as possible, that's ideal. So I think the integrated services, the changes in the regs have really enhanced our ability to do that. I think, we still need some more work. I'm not an IT expert. I'm not even close, to sort of understanding what's behind the curtain there. I do know that, I have regular interaction with our Epic team, for example, making sure that within the Epic system, all of our locations are set up in the system so that the right information, so they reach out to me on a regular basis anytime they're being asked to set up a new, I don't even know what they call it, cost center. No, it's not really a cost center, but they set up a new site in Epic, and they're needing to make sure, is it an Article 28? Is it an Article 31? Is it an FQHC? Is it, faculty practice? And just making sure that the system is set up to deal with that, so that the billing and reimbursement can be done in a way that, is obviously compliant, and also that can, pardon the phone ringing, and, making sure that we're able to, get reimbursed for the services that we're providing. And so I think that's a challenge. I think to your point of, some of the regulations, and certainly the requirements for the security confidentiality of mental health and substance use disorder records, and information on patient visits. And even actually we've experienced that with our sites that are licensed under OPWDD, and there's a lot of layers there. And so each time you set out to do something, it becomes, okay, well, we can set it up this way, but we have to make sure that we take into account these other things. Or to your point about, there's, and I don't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but in the behavioral health, they've used different systems to, keep the records. And I think that's a constant challenge. And I'm not sure, I'm not as cognizant of any regulations around it per se. So if I were to just sort of make a guess that the regulations aren't keeping up with, what is needed. And now, of course, with telehealth, you have this whole other level, because you read in the telehealth regs and the guidance and the Medicaid update for DOH, a lot of things about security, and especially in the telemental regs about, the security and confidentiality. And, I think about a provider sitting at home, for example, and having a telemental visit with a patient who's, potentially sitting in their home, for example. And, you're allowed to do that. The provider is credentialed and whatever, and they talk about a secure environment. But what does that mean, right? Because, if you think about in our day and age, like, I feel like I walk around and nothing is secure. So what does that mean? They have those words in regulation, but what does that really mean? And, what potentially could be a problem there? So,
right.
I think, the more coordinated those things can be up front as it moves along, the better that's going to be. But that's about all I can comment on.
I mean, one of the things, and you really mentioned it, one of the things that I feel like I encounter working with districts and PPSs and, folks trying to look at care transitions and access to care constantly really are those consent issues. And, it doesn't have to be the substance use, higher confidentiality status, but,
right.
And I think it is a theme of this interview that, we still have a lot of work to do in this area, that oftentimes I'll be meeting potentially with two people who each have their own consent form, and everybody just says it. The world would be a much better place if you just used my consent form.
Right, right. I didn't even mention the consent. All of the consent issues. Yeah, absolutely right.
So that one still, still seems to be confounding us. And, as we talk about like, a universal application around satellites or licensed programs, or being able to look at that in a more holistic way, I think, starting to think about that consent in a different way, so that as a consumer, I know if I place myself as the Medicaid recipient who's getting asked 150 times, I kind of much rather have one person explain it
right.
to me. And then be able to say to that one person, here are the people who are on my care team, and here's the people, who I don't, can know everything. Here's the people that I only want to know certain things. And, that's something that, again, I haven't seen a whole lot of movement on and change.
Yeah.
On.
And that's a real challenge when you think about, whether it's, whether you have a consent form that is, only particular to a site that patient's going to and the care team that's at that site, or is the ability to extend that consent beyond that. But then, of course, where does it stop? And then, of course, all the lawyers in the room are going to say, you need to get a consent signed every time, somebody goes to some new place, because, something, you need to protect yourself. And of course, we have a world of lawyers on the other side who are looking at any hole that they can, go through if something happens. So yeah, consent's a real challenge too.
Yep. All right, so now we're in our prediction mode. I have not been moving ahead in a good way here. So in our predictions, and we won't hold you to these, and unless you get them all like 100% right, Randi, and then we'll give you an award for being the most brilliant predictor. But
there you go.
If we did give you that sort of that crystal ball, what might you see in the next year that you think might be coming down the pike in terms of regulatory changes?
So I think, unfortunately, I see, all of the agencies in the state, plunking down their version of these regulations, certainly in the next year. Mm-hmm. And, I haven't heard, and I think that, that might be something that we want to go to the associations to talk about. I've been involved in, especially on the Department of Health side, in trying to do transformation and streamlining, and was involved in a number of meetings, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and that sort of has quieted down in the last 2 years. And I mean, I think we need to circle back to them because it's, you know, it's really difficult to wade through all of this, and each thing is separate. And so I would love to be able to predict that that's going to happen. I mean, I know it's certainly not going to happen in the next year, but, you know, maybe 2 or 3 years from now, when you know, there's the ability to discuss this more with them as they've put out their first, you know, their first attempt at dealing with, you know, certainly the world of telehealth, and that we would see more coordination. I think with integrated services, it's actually been out there a while, and, you know, it's an opportunity. And I know I, just in my own way, have had conversations with people at the various agencies saying, you know, can't we just do this in one way? And they recognize it, but nothing gets done. So, you know, maybe we can help to push that agenda a little bit. But I think certainly in the near future, there's just going to be a lot more. You know, each agency is going to put out, you know, their set of regulations. And I wish I could say that things would change, but I've certainly seen in recent years that there's just more regulatory language put out on things and not less. The only other thing I would say is especially in the world of Medicaid, that the state needs to do a better job with coordinating with Medicaid managed care companies so that they understand that Medicaid is putting out these requirements or the ability to bill in a certain way, and needing to get the managed care companies on board earlier rather than later, so that they understand why this direction is being gone into and why it's important for them to, you know, sort of be on that bandwagon.
Thank you, Randi. We really appreciate you sharing your ideas and thoughts on regulation, technology, telehealth, integrated care, and sharing some predictions with us. Thank you for attending this webinar.